Am I live? Let's have a look. Hi guys, good to see you guys here. What do you think of this image that I've got up here? Does that look to you like Caitlin? What do you guys think? Does that look to you like Caitlin? Okay, so I must apologize beforehand. I've had two beers. Today, South Africa played Wales, a rugby game, and I watched that and obviously watched it while indulging in alcohol. So I might be a little bit off my game, but hopefully not. Yeah, I don't know whether this might be Caitlin over here. The hair looks right. I don't know if the rest is right. I wonder what you guys think. As I said, the hair looks the right level, the right length, and the right sort of kinkiness, but the rest, I'm not sure. What do you guys think? Cheers. Thanks, Liesel. Okay, so in this live stream, I'm going to take you guys through the whole Baby, I Want You Back So Bad part two. There were some complaints with people saying, where does that come from? Well, you're going to find out in this particular analysis. Timmy, can you settle down? So let's just have a look at who's here. Liesel McGuire, SM Kobylinski says it does look like her. Onesie says not Caitlin's figure. You know, if you remember that image of Caitlin taken where her back is to you, she did seem quite slight. She looked kind of thin, and this person looks not as slight or thin, in my opinion. Terry Dean says no complainers here. Okay. Mel Stiller, good to see you. Yvonne Phillips, Margaret Zabinski, all the usual suspects, good to see you here. Seems to be quite a lot of interest in today's topic. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to go through some of Colin Strickland's backstory. I see 96% of you, basically all of you, saying that his backstory is relevant, and yes, indeed, it is. Just generally, in terms of true crime, the backstory of all the people closest to the situation are very, very relevant. So, this is going to be a discussion about an analysis about identity, and those are always very compelling. They're always very interesting. So I hope you guys are going to find it, interesting. It usually is. Um, and then after that, I'm hoping to show you guys some of Teal Akerson's Instagram. I'm not 100% sure if this computer is going to allow me to do that, but we'll see what we can get away with. Jay Kate says love from Scotland. I must say, Jay Kate, I've been looking a little bit at the Scottish Open, or is it the Scottish Open? The game being played at St Andrews, and it really looks like it's very dry there. Has it been very hot in Scotland? Onesie says, who won the rugby? Well, the Springboks, of course. Sarah Moon says, this is fascinating. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to just go on to this background, or not background, but you know what I mean, and make myself a little bit smaller. Okay, so in some ways, I feel Colin Strickland is the missing link in the love triangle. Although we are far from knowing adequately who Mo Wilson was or Caitlin Armstrong, we do have a working knowledge of both of them. But Strickland has remained something of an enigma, something of an unknown quantity. So I found two articles, two interviews from January and June 2020 that sheds more light on this shadowy figure. And this is where are those articles now? This is the one article, and this one is from Velonews, and it is dated January 2020. And we're going to deal with this one first. And then there's also this article from Cycling News. I actually thought that I may have written for Cycling News in the past, but I've only written for Cycling Weekly, which is a UK publication. But anyway, this is another excellent publication dealing with the 5 races that changed my life. What's so important about this article is it's sort of provided in a first-person narrative, and that really makes it quite interesting. Okay, so we're going to get to this one, but we're going to start off with that one. Okay, so I'm going to provide a link to the Velonews article. I'll put a link in the chat for those of you who are interested. KD says, no doubt he'll be called to testify at some point. Terry Dean says, my 3 favorite words, let's get started. Okay, well, here we go. So this is dealing with this particular article. So we're also going to get to the part where he says, baby, I want you back so bad, and in what context. So the article is titled, Colin Strickland chose Dirty Kanza over Paris-Roubaix and EF Pro Cycling. Here's why. Do any of you guys know what that actually means? Do you guys know what Paris-Roubaix is? Do you know what EF Pro Cycling is? Any takers? Bloomer or red-pilled girl, just recently getting interested in the story. So it's good to see almost all of you saying no, with one exception. Bria says yes. So Bria lives in France, and I think Bria is aware of a lot of this because of races like the Tour de France. And, you know, if you had to ask me, you know, what have you been doing today? I've been watching sport, and among the sporting things I've been watching is the Tour de France. As it happens, one of South Africa's riders did particularly well today in the Tour de France. So if you're not familiar with professional cycling or the professional cycling circuit, don't worry. You're in good hands because I am familiar with it. I once did photography for the South Sea Tour of South Africa. So I was actually in the vehicle with Phil Liggett, the voice of cycling, and other journalists and so on. And yeah, so I have covered it in that sense. I've also interviewed the likes of Tyler Hamilton, who was Lance Armstrong's former teammate. I did an article for GQ magazine. I've also written for Tour de France magazine, and I've interviewed tour winners like Chris Froome. You might not have heard of any of these people, but they are some of the who's who in the past of you know, very high level of cycling. Chris Froome actually also appears in one Instagram post alongside Strickland. He's someone who spent a little bit of time in South Africa. I've also interviewed Daryl Impey, a top South African rider, and I think it's the first South African to win a stage of the Tour de France. So although you don't need to be an expert in cycling to understand the psychology surrounding it, it does help to have a basic grounding in the sport. When you follow these riders, the ones that I've just mentioned, but also the current really good riders, you get to know the races they race and the sponsors jostling to snag the best riders. EF Pro Cycling is an American professional cycling team, also referred to as EF Education Easy Post. They're recognized by their bright pink jerseys. And so here is a quick glimpse at the EF Education jersey. It looks like this, right? Okay, well, let's take it back to this article. Okay, so as I say, you don't really need to know what any of that means, except to be aware that the Formula One sponsors of professional cycling essentially approached Strickland about 2 years ago, right? And invited him to compete in pro cycling. In other words, he was invited to join the big time. It was really, he was being offered a fairy tale. And Velonews describes how this came about. And I'm going to put this in chat so you can go through it at the same time I am. I hope it's not too long. Okay. So this is a quote from Velonews. The moment Colin Strickland stepped off his bicycle after the win, after he won the 2019 Dirty Kanza, the world wanted a piece of him. Reporters buzzed his telephone, photographers snapped his picture, sponsors filled his email inbox with messages. And then his response to that was he said, well, it was just more interviews, more videos to produce. He said, I'm always busy, but yeah, there were more things to attend to, which is all good. Now, I don't know about you, but either that response speaks of modesty or Strickland has kind of a chip on his shoulder. Maybe it's both, but he seems to be complaining about having to do more work as a result of his success. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it, that Strickland would be averse to work or to effort when clearly he has the work ethic to become a very strong bike rider. But the catastrophe with Caitland and Mo didn't happen, I believe, because things were so perfect, but because there was a fatal flaw somewhere. And then the question is, where was this fatal flaw? So going back to the article, they basically say, let me just bring up another image here. So going back to the article, they say the outreach was understandable. So the outreach from the sponsors was, they say, understandable. Not only had Strickland won gravel cycling's biggest race, he had handily beaten the handful of World Tour road racers who attended the 2019 edition of the race. That's kind of just a little bit of jargon to say that Strickland had sort of blown away some of the best riders in the world, right? And on his own turf, but basically showing that he had a big engine. And then going back to the article, quote, and Strickland's personal story, the late bloomer who didn't get into bike racing until his mid-20s, quickly made its way through cycling media. And I really want to emphasize that and highlight that. That's really important. Strickland's personal story, in other words, the thing that really defined him was this late bloomer who didn't get into bike racing until his mid-20s, relatively late. And then Strickland as a entity started sort of circulating through the cycling media. And this is how and why sponsors started paying attention, right? Yeah, late to the game of cycling, right? Late to the game of cycling. Scariella says, hello from Maine, USA. Okay, so going a bit further into the article, it says, at Velonews, Strickland's victory reminded us of a comment made in 2018 by Strickland's teammate who said, Colin is the most genetically talented cyclist I know. If he had started racing younger, he could have been a domestique at Quickstep. He's that strong, right? So what you are getting here is reinforcement that he's a particularly strong rider, but also a particularly talented rider, but also he's late to the party. So while on the one hand there's potential here, there's also a problem. The fact that he's sort of come onto the scene quite late, right? So that's quite a compliment to give, to say he's the most genetically talented cyclist I know, right? And then the qualification there, if he had started racing younger, right? Now, do you guys know what it means to say he could have been a domestique at Quickstep? So Quickstep is another racing team. Let's just see if I can find it here. I think it's this image. So these are the guys from the Koenig Quickstep, and Quickstep is just another big racing team, and that is what he's referring to, right? Um, so for the pro teams to want to woo Strickland is a tremendous honor. It's a feather in his cap. But there are a few references in the fairy tale backstory that cast a shadow on his reputation. He started racing in his late 20s and is described as a late bloomer. Typically, 30-something riders are in the end game, they're in the retirement phase of racing. And we know that Strickland right now is already 35. So in the words of Star Wars, he's too old. He's too old to become a Jedi, right? And look at Luke's response here. But I've learned so much. How can you do this? It's unfair, right? Now, as I say, you may remember both Luke Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars being told that they were too old and how they responded to that. So that's going a bit ahead of where we want to get to. And so when they were told they were old, they both were very disappointed and indignant. And although they did eventually train to become Jedis, Anakin went over to the dark side, right? Now, with Strickland, you have a talented, top-performing elite cyclist, just like a talented Jedi who must be trained, or someone who could be a Jedi, someone who's strong with the Force, right? But he's still seen as too old to be offered a proper contract. And this is where things get interesting. See, he's offered a contract, but Strickland doesn't feel it's good enough. He doesn't think the contract is good enough. And maybe he's right, but that is the situation. So going back to the article from Velonews, let's just go back to it here. As it turns out, other people in the world of cycling saw a similar quality when they looked at Strickland and his win. One of those was someone called Jonathan Vaughters, the CEO of EF Pro Cycling. Remember EF Pro Cycling? That is this. Well, this is the jersey of EF Pro Cycling, right? Here is another one. And so Jonathan Vaughters, the CEO of the cycling team, contacted Strickland about racing for the World Tour team in 2020, 2 years ago. And this is the critical thing to bear in mind here. Voters wanted Strickland to race the cobblestone classics, most notably Paris-Roubaix. Now, I'm sure Bria knows what that means. So Strickland was actually invited to race in Europe, and this is his chance. This is his big break. This is his chance to completely turn his life around. He can make a fortune. He can make a big name for himself. His whole life can change very, very quickly. Zircon says, didn't Mo start late? No, Mo was 10 years younger. She definitely didn't start late. Put it this way, the time it took Mo to become world champion and the time it took Colin to become world champion, a lot longer. I suppose you could say Mo could have started mountain biking a little bit earlier, but it's not quite the same situation. Katie says Mo had been an athlete prior. She was a skier. I get what Zircon's saying, but the thing is Mo achieved success very young, whereas Colin achieved it already, only in his 30s. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go on a little bit. Yeah. Yvonne, you're 100% right there. The cobblestone classics sound like a great challenge. Now, what I want you to look at is, this is a picture of Colin Strickland riding on gravel, right? You can see he's in the lead. Here is another image of him in the same kind of circumstances. You can see it's obviously a tough setup. There he is again riding on gravel. You can see it's not the easiest sport. And then there is Paris-Roubaix. And that is like, well, that is a cobbled road that you're seeing there. And there's another image, I don't have it here, but there's another image where on the same section of road, you see a whole group of riders falling on the ground here. These cobblestone roads are very slippery. They are very treacherous. They're very bumpy. And the whole idea is to ride over them as fast as you can, but it's very slippery. It's definitely very slippery. And there's a bit better image of it, but you can kind of see from the perspective of how hardcore it is. If you just take this rider who's covered in dirt and you imagine it's this rider, right? That is what these pro cycling guys were thinking. You know, couldn't this rider, this gravel rider, couldn't he do quite well in this format in Europe? But that was really what is kind of going on, right? So it's quite an interesting strategy from EF Pro Cycling, but Paris-Roubaix is a particularly tough race in France. It's actually also known as the Hull of the North. That's how tough it is. It's often too tough for the average flimsily built, light as a feather professional rider. So if you look at these professional riders, a lot of the average riders don't have strong enough arms, shoulders, and whatever to deal with a race like this. You've got to be a strong rider. You've got to be light, but you've also got to be strong. And Colin Strickland was one of those riders. A strong rider, not the lightest rider in the world, but definitely one of the strongest, right? And to understand what Paris-Roubaix is about, it's racing over bone-rattling, dirty cobblestone sections, and what that does is it exacts a toll on even the toughest rider. And Strickland is, I guess, one of the toughest riders, which is why you would imagine he would possibly do quite well there. And that is what these managers and pro cycling dudes were seeing. They were seeing an opportunity here. And in their opinion, they thought maybe Strickland is the perfect choice for Paris-Roubaix. Does that make sense? And so so this is a statement from Velonews made by Vaughters, why they were interested in Strickland. This is the statement that he made. He said, I was interested because he has a big motor, referring to Colin Strickland. I was like, this guy has an interesting engine. He can get up to speed on how to race on the tiny roads in Europe. And then he's basically, when he says that, the tiny roads in Europe, he's talking about those cobblestone roads, right? And then he said, I'll take the bet that this guy would really do well, right? I will take that bet. Okay, so not surprisingly for a guy whose identity was wrapped up in cycling, if you go to his Instagram, he was saying, I ride in circles, or something about I'm a bike rider, whatever. This was being offered the big time, the cycling big time. It's like an actor being accepted by Hollywood. It is like, I'm trying to think of another example. It's like a person in the Star Wars universe who shows some kind of knowledge of the Force, being invited to become a Jedi. It's a big opportunity, right? Um, and so it was really a big carrot. And so the question is, what was Strickland's response to being invited? What do you think he thought? What do you think he said when he was when he was offered this invitation? Well, this is what he said, and this is quoting another quote from Velonews. He said, "It was super exciting and hugely flattering. I've been watching the classics for years, and the classics are races like Paris-Roubaix. And that would be an area of pro cycling I would most want to jump into. It was like, wow, that's exciting. Let's do it," right? So he was excited about it. It was a big deal to him. Where he says, "I've been watching the classics for years," that shows you he's been dreaming. That is the thing that has been inspiring him. And then he also says that's the area. So, if someone said, what sort of area of cycling would you most like to get into? Well, this is exactly it, right? So he's offered basically exactly what he wants. He's offered exactly what he wants. He said, "I would most want to jump into classics like Paris-Roubaix." So here he is offered that opportunity. And then what do you think happens? Do you think it turns out great? Do you think he ends up going and it all turns out wonderfully? Well, for a clue, look at the image behind me, right? Copper Petal says, "A form of exercising should not be a passion of someone's life. Clearly, it's unhealthy." Well, that is, I think, a very narrow way of looking at something. There are plenty of professional athletes in the world that live wonderful lives. Think about Wimbledon tennis players, golf players, and so on. Now, I must say I disagree with that. I do think that there can be an unhealthy component to that, especially if you don't succeed. And that's what I'm trying to get at in this particular instance. Yvonne Phillips says, "But for Colin, money is more important." Well, that's the question. Roses are red. Good to see you here. Pauline says his excited response is in contrast to his seemingly indifferent feelings to what his girlfriend did. Good point. So anyway, the point is he's offered the chance of a lifetime. He's been working very hard. He's been dreaming about this sort of thing, and now he has the chance to do it, right? And although he's offered this chance, there are these reservations. He's too old, right? But he's nevertheless invited to do that, right? Let's just go to another image. Let's go to this one. So you can see here he's far ahead of the other riders. He clearly is a talented rider. And so what does he do with that talent? What does he do with this opportunity? Spirit of 1776 is participating in any professional sport requires complete dedication. Absolutely. Someone says they're sorry they're late. Well, it's good to have you here. Karina says, "And sailors, skiers, the list is endless." Yeah, you can make quite a good life out of professional sport if you're good enough. So Robbie Robin says, "Did he mess it up? Did he mess it up?" So he's excited about it. He says, "This is the thing I would most want to jump into." And he also says, "Wow, that's exciting. Let's do it." So what do you think happens? You've got this hard worker on the bike who finally gets his break when he's 33 years old. Well, what does he do with it? Well, here's the story from Velonews. So Velonews says, quote, In the ensuing weeks, that's after this offer, conversations stalled and eventually petered out. Voters' proposed plan for gravel cycling's newest hero to race Paris-Roubaix did not come to fruition. So it didn't happen despite this offer, despite it being so important to Strickland. It didn't happen. And if you think about it, if Strickland had gone, would this whole thing with Mo, would this love triangle even have happened? In other words, if Strickland had gone to Europe, would this love triangle have been able to form? Just something quite interesting to think about. And instead of him going on the one fairy tale, he ended up choosing a different path, and look where it's taken him. And so instead of going to Europe, instead of joining this, taking hold of this opportunity to race Paris-Roubaix, he simply didn't accept the offer. And instead, he recommitted himself, in the words of Velonews, to another year on the gravel circuit. And then Velonews asks rhetorically, what happened? And then answers the question saying, as so often in cycling, money, opportunity, and pro cycling's rigid sponsorship model became impediments that the collective push was unable to overcome. And I don't know if you remember Strickland talking about the inertia of his relationship with Caitlin. Well, it looks like he had a certain amount of inertia as well that he couldn't overcome. You could also argue that the cycling fraternity that invited him also had a certain amount of inertia where they wouldn't budge on their offer, right? But that is really what it comes down to. But one of the words that comes out of that is the word money. The reason that it didn't happen, or one of the reasons, was money. So let me just put that quote in chat just so you guys can see it. Pauline Buckle says, like Scott Peterson's pro golfing dreams dashed, or Barry Morphew's baseball dreams. That's really interesting intertextuality. I think the difference, though, Pauline, is I don't think Colin Strickland is guilty of a serious crime here, whereas Scott Peterson clearly is and was, right? Okay, so in a real sense, Strickland was arguing about money, but also letting go of his principal sponsor, Red Bull. In other words, he would have had to give up certain things. He would have to make sacrifices, like a Jedi would need to, in order to get the benefits of this other world. So in other words, in order to take the ticket and enter this other world, this world that he's been dreaming about, he's going to have to give up certain things. But Strickland felt he didn't want to let go of all the things he'd already worked for, right? And so because he couldn't let go of the one thing, well, then he lost the other thing. And think about that in relation to Caitlin and Mo, right? So going back to the article, Vaughters' offer to Strickland carried a smaller salary than Strickland was currently earning from his collection of sponsors. So before you're too quick to judge Strickland as greedy or money grubbing, or that his decision to reject the offer was in some way a flaw, just think about it in a basic way. Would you accept an opportunity, but you also given a lower salary? Would you do that? And although I think there are a lot of other things surrounding it, that was the deal breaker essentially for him. It's like, I'm a world champion, or I'm world class. Why are you offering me such a low amount of money? Well, part of the answer to that, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but part of the answer to that was he proved himself in a certain theater, but he hadn't yet proved himself in another theater. And the other problem was, of course, that he was too old, right? He's too old. And so if he can prove himself in another theater, well, then everything changes. But that is the if. And he's got to address that question. Is he prepared to address that question? So in Vaughters' eyes, in the eyes of this um, cycling team, this cycling team, he felt the entry-level salary made sense because Strickland was an unproven quantity, right? He hadn't proved himself yet in this particular thing. And Strickland didn't really feel like that he needed to. He didn't feel like he had to. But is that fair? Is that fair to say, I've already proved myself? What do you guys think of that? Bria says age is a huge issue in professional sports for sure. Definitely. It's not just in cycling. It's age is something that basically moves the sell-by date of any athlete. Basically says your time is up, kind of thing, right? Timmy, can you? Whoa. Okay, Timmy's getting a bit restless. Terry Dean says, makes me think of top PGA golfers going over to the LIV golf tour. That's a really good analogy. That's a really good analogy. Okay. So in voters' eyes, the eyes of the dude who'd extended this invitation, the question was, you're an unproven quantity, you are quite old, and so I'm going to give you an entry-level salary, I'm going to give you an opportunity, and you can then make something of it or not, right? And this is where, as I said, Strickland's age was a factor. If Strickland was a younger rider, the risk would be lower if the contract didn't pan out. Now, bear in mind, it's not just a sort of straight line like ABC. If Strickland accepted the offer and he went to Paris-Roubaix, right? He went and raced there. He could easily fall. A lot of riders do fall. A lot of professional riders don't finish the race. So there just is inherently a lot of risk involved. So he could train, he could do everything right. Somebody could bump him, he could slip on the road, he could just be unlucky, he could get a flat tire. Anything could happen. He could also just get sick, and then what? Then has this gamble paid off, right? If he's unlucky, right? So just going back to Velonews, they basically provide a little bit more background for the risk that was associated with this offer. Thanks a lot, Pooh's Blustery Day. Treats for Timmy. Thanks a lot for that. Let me highlight that. Thanks a lot for that. Oh, I see. Which dog have you got? I actually just introduced Timmy to a friend of mine's dog today. Just quite an interesting interaction. So this was a little bit of further thoughts on the topic from Voters. He says, I'm going to pay him the same as I'm going to pay any first-year guy who's coming in. And then he said, my perspective in terms of Strickland was, hey, take the risk and take the small paycheck. And if you finish top 10 at Paris-Roubaix, that's when you'll get the big paycheck. So take the risk, prove yourself. Take the check, prove yourself, and then the money will come. And you kind of get the sense that Strickland didn't want to do that. He wanted to get the big money quickly or something like that. Or he didn't feel, he thought the risk was too great, right? But you nevertheless have the dude in charge of the cycling team saying, I think that you could do well. I think you should take the risk, and who knows? And then what is Strickland going to do with that, right? So Yvonne Phillips asks, if he wanted more money, could he have tried to negotiate more? Well, he couldn't have negotiated a better entry-level salary, but obviously if he performed well, in other words, if his first results were good, then he could do that, definitely. But basically, starting off, he would need to prove himself, and he would be given a salary until he does prove himself, kind of thing. Okay, so let's go on. So, in other words, Strickland was asked to back himself in the situation, to be brave and to bet on the big time. This is what he'd been dreaming about all along. And so, guess what he does? He lets the ship sail. He doesn't accept the offer, and he goes back to what he's been doing. So instead of going to this world, he goes to back to that one. And it might be the right decision. Whatever his reasoning was, it might have been the right decision. But what do you think that felt like? And this is where we get under his skin, where we burrow into his psychology. And you say, so perhaps he allowed the decision to pass him by. That's one thing. And maybe it was the right decision. But how did it feel like after he did that? What feeling did he have in the aftermath when he just stayed where he was and he continued doing races the way he was? In other words, nothing changed. He was offered something, he didn't accept the offer, but then he ends up just staying where he is and continues doing where he is. Do you think that there's something that's going to eat at him? Do you think there's going to be a sense of disappointment and wondering what could have happened, right? And the reason why I made this particular poster, you see the top of Strickland here and you see the bottom there. And in the middle is this dark, empty area. That's what I think is what he experienced, was that he allowed this ship to sail. He allowed this opportunity to pass. And then I'm sure I don't know whether he regretted it, but he kept thinking about it, right? It was still in the back of his mind. I think every time he watched Paris-Roubaix, he would say, I could have been there. Coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? If. And so I think that's got to hurt. That's got to be wounding. This great opportunity, this dream that you've had that is now floating out there and you did nothing about it. That's got to be frustrating. And it may be that Strickland had a plan B in the works. Maybe he thought, I can't take advantage of this plan now, but if I can get hold of more money, if I can sort out my financial affairs, then later on, maybe I will have the confidence, I will have the I will have the security to take this gamble. And maybe that is where Caitlin came in, right? So think about it. Strickland may have said, I can't do this right now, but if I can get a hold of some money and backing from another source, and then give Paris-Roubaix another shot, and then perhaps if I fail then, well, then at least I've got something else to rely on. And that's maybe where those Airstream, that whole business where that came into it. So as I say, perhaps the fallback plan was Caitlin and the properties they were flipping. I also think Strickland's backstory as a pro who started too late, who got offered his break as a late bloomer, is a potential reason why he was so attracted to 25-year-old Mo Wilson. Think about that. He starts late. He's a late bloomer. And at the same time that he's feeling this sense of missed opportunities, this young rider comes along who is a reminder in a way of himself and of opportunities that are grasped by a young person, not himself, but somebody else. And then he finds this particular person interesting. He finds her journey very compelling. It also reminds him, he contrasts it with his own journey, right? But I'm just saying that is something that is definitely going to grab his attention. Her journey versus his journey, and what about the mistakes he's made, kind of thing. Remember, Mo Wilson was a youngster taking the world by storm, and was sort of a version of the fairy tale he wished he'd had. And so, in a real sense, Strickland was perhaps a cautionary tale for Mo on what not to do. But sometimes the moth gets too close to the flame. The thing that guides you, the light that illuminates your way, can also burn you. Strickland felt the same way about accepting the potentially one-off offer from EF Education. If he fell during Paris-Roubaix, that fall could cost him everything. And that is exactly what he said, right? That is exactly what he said. So he said, if I accepted it, it would mean sacrificing the program I've been steadily building over the last 3 years. And then this part really stands out. He said, if I accepted that, it would mean scrapping those relationships with brands that are all in behind me with gravel to jump on the EF train and let them do all the deal making and hold the contracts and hope that I prove myself valuable to them. But think about just the words that he's using here: scrapping those relationships, jumping onto a train, deal making. Can I prove myself valuable? Think about those words in relation to this whole love triangle thing. And Caitlin, is she proving herself valuable to Colin? In the middle of him trying to prove himself valuable to his sponsors. And also Mo trying to prove herself valuable to her sponsors. Penelope Mason says, hi, Nick, so informative. Thanks for that. Bria says, if he's motivated by money, then he may have felt that business endeavors with Caitlin might have been an easier way for him to get money than training and competing. Bria, I don't think he's only motivated by money. I think there was a part of him that enjoyed what he did. I think he was a successful rider. I think he was a talented rider. So I don't think he was just all about money. I think if it was all about money, he certainly wouldn't have taken up cycling. I can say the same as a writer. If I was totally focused on money, I don't think I would have become a writer, right? And that doesn't mean I don't care about money, and it doesn't mean I'm have a particular persuasion with writing. It means you try and balance both of them, but you can sometimes be pulled one way or another. I think a good analogy in terms of my personal experience and Strickland was, at a certain point, I had to decide, am I going to continue with magazine journalism, which is what I knew and what I'd been doing all along. You can write a magazine article, or I could, in a quarter of a day, and pay your rent with that article. Obviously, that's not enough to live on. You need another 2 or 3 articles, right? But you could do a fairly small amount of work and then get paid in a certain way. Of course, you didn't have a guarantee that it would be used, but then there was book writing, and so that was a totally different dimension. And I was, of course, an unproven quantity in writing books. I was a proven quantity in writing magazine articles. And so the point came where I felt I can't serve both masters. I can't do magazine journalism and write books. And so I made what I think is quite an extraordinary gamble, which was, I said, I'm going to stop the magazine journalism and I'm going to continue only writing books. And most people would have said, you're insane. That'll never, ever work. But I think what most people would not have appreciated was how fast I can write, and the field in which I was writing, and then also my expertise. And so in that particular scenario, I backed myself. I also understood the risks and I took the chance. And I mean, I did that as a 40-year-old. So I was, although it's not sport, it's nevertheless life. I took a very serious gamble, and fortunately, it paid off. And I don't write magazine articles anymore, and I don't want to, and I've never looked back. At this point, I don't even need to write books anymore. But the difference between a magazine article and a book is you write a magazine article, you get paid for it once. And even today, I saw an article I wrote, the world's most sophisticated bicycle. I wrote that for a magazine called Brainstorm. That article is still up on Brainstorm today, and it's behind a paywall, and the publication is earning money off my work, right? Whereas if you write a book, the book, if it's good enough, obviously, the book can continue selling. You write it one time, but the book can continue selling day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And you get that benefit from having done the work once compared to doing all of this repetitive work. Now, with Strickland, if he had gone to Europe and he had performed well in a race, he could have short-tracked or fast-tracked his success in a way. Of course, as I say, it's a little bit different to writing. With writing, you're not going to fall off your chair and break your back, and now you can't write anymore. With professional cycling, you can literally fall and be out for a whole year or something like that. And I would say that Paris-Roubaix is probably a lot more dangerous than this sort of thing. If you look at this is, obviously there are situations like that where it is wet and muddy. So there are treacherous conditions, but as treacherous conditions go, that is very treacherous. That is very difficult and dangerous, right? Pauline says maybe he wanted to become Mo by association. Okay, so I hope my analogy just makes it a bit more explicable to you what we're talking about. He had to take a risk, and then he didn't take that risk, right? And then what do you do with that feeling where you realize I got this opportunity that I've always wanted and I didn't use it, right? What does that do to you? So again, think about the language he uses where he says, scrapping those relationships with brands that are all in behind me with gravel to jump on the EF train and let them do all of the deal making and hold the contracts and hope that I prove myself valuable to them. If you think about the language, think about how those words, those semantics apply to Caitlin and Mo. Think about those words, scrapping those relationships to jump on the train in the hope that I prove myself valuable to them. Didn't Caitlin feel the same way? Even Mo seemed to feel the same way, where she said in a text message to him, I feel very confused. I don't know where I stand with you, right? And yet in his private life, there was this status of flux going on as well. Do I change gear and do I go into that direction? And so I think there were a couple of similar tracks going on in his mind. The idea of changing direction as a rider. Well, if you're not going to do that, couldn't you change direction as a lover, as a person, kind of thing? And think about Caitlin as well. She'd made something of herself in a different way. Wasn't she trying to prove herself to Colin, prove herself valuable, only to be scrapped? And I'm talking about someone who came from quite a difficult situation, someone who was emotionally, I think, quite sensitive and vulnerable, someone who was quite suffering from anxiety. And she's with this guy who is about to make major changes in his life that are going to affect her, right? And so she must be wondering, has she proved herself valuable only to be scrapped by him, right? So this is where the quote, "It's like, baby, I want you back so bad," this is where it comes from. And so this is from Velonews. Colin Strickland says the following. He says, if you have a bad year, they could decide not to sign me back. And then you're back to square one, banging on the doors of sponsors who left for this shinier thing. It's like, baby, I want you back so bad. That's where it comes from. That's where it comes from. So I think you've got to think about the psychology where you say, if you have a bad year, so you can see that's quite a negative perception. It's quite a negative thing to be thinking there. I don't know whether the pandemic had a role, maybe thought, what if I get COVID? What if I get sick? What if the races are cancelled? What's going to happen then? But I do think that this is all about a kind of cycling adultery. Do I abandon my sponsors? Do I allow myself to believe that the grass is greener on the other side, right? Now, let me say that again. Do I allow myself to believe the grass is greener on the other side? And if I do, and things go south, will they take me back? In other words, he's saying, well, what if I believe the grass is greener on the other side and I go to the other side? Will I be allowed to come back, right? And although that kind of makes sense, you can see how that's going to be a problem, right? You need to be fully committed. There can't be doubt in your mind, right? So in a situation like this, like I was in, I don't know if I thought about it as the grass being greener, but I thought I'm going to write books instead of magazine articles, right? You can't then come back. Once you go down that road, you've got to stay the course. And in the beginning, things may not work out. And when things aren't working out, you can't come back because then you really are going to fail. So you kind of got to, once you commit, you've got to stay committed. You can't kind of say, you can't kind of leave the door open to coming back because as soon as you run into hardship, then you're going to want to go back, right? And that's not going to be good for anyone. It's not going to be good for the sponsors, it's not going to be good for him. But that is nevertheless the mindset that he has. Now think about that mindset and flirting with Mo and sort of going into a relationship with Mo and then coming back to Caitlin, right? Think about how that is similar. Think about the parallel of that world where you go out of the one cycling theater into another cycling arena and how that is parallel to his relationship world. And again, think about the words, it's like, baby, I want you back so bad. You know, you leave something, but only to pine for it later on, right? So wasn't Mo, this younger, shiny, promising rider, also a symbol of a younger, shinier, more confident Strickland? This once brave warrior who bravely took risks and then became an even greater champion as a result. Excuse me, that's who he wants to be. He wants to be this sort of Jedi figure, but at his heart, he feels that the risk is strategically not sound, not smart, right? And so we go back to Vaughters and what Vaughters says when he says, you know, what did Vaughters see? So this is a experienced rider who is, I almost said writer, an experienced rider who is he has a vision for this particular rider. He has a vision for his potential. And obviously, Strickland also has a vision for his potential, but it's not quite the same. It's not quite aligned. And so what is Vaughters thinking ultimately? What is that fairy tale? And so he says, Choice, good to see you here. So he says, my dream for him. So that is the guy who's in charge of EF education. He says, my dream for him wasn't to win Dirty Kanza, it was to do well at Roubaix, but that's a scary risk for a 33-year-old. I'm sure he has more financial responsibilities than a 22-year-old kid. Well, he's absolutely right with that. Sue Kavanaugh, thanks very much. Your YouTube channel is my favorite for this case. Thanks a lot, Sue. Sue, you are in luck. I know quite a lot about cycling. In fact, earlier today, I was riding my exercise bike while watching the Tour de France. So I do have a little bit of background in it. So even Vaughters was aware that this is a risk, but he thought it's a risk worth taking. It's because of his talent, it was a risk worth taking, right? And then the question is, could he overcome his fear? Could he be brave in this circumstance, right? And so Vaughters is quite conciliatory here. He says the following. He says, I get his logic, meaning I get Strickland's logic in making the decision. He says, but what I was hoping for is that he'd have taken the chance. So he was saying what Strickland decided was logical. It made sense. It was a sound decision, but he was thinking, wow, sometimes you need to take a big risk. Sometimes you need to take a chance on yourself. And even when you can't be absolutely certain of the outcome, right? And one's got to wonder, how could the lives of these three people have changed if Colin did take the chance, if he did back himself, if he did take this brave step? Could his life have improved? Could Caitlin's life have improved? Could Mo's life have improved? It's hard to not believe that. It's hard. I mean, it's easy to say if, but it's hard not to believe that. Sue Kavanaugh says, I live in Austin, so I know a couple of people in the cycling community. There's going to be a huge story in the Austin Statesman about this case on Sunday. Okay, well, we'll look out for that. Maybe we'll speak to Paul again. Terry Dean says, no risk, no biscuit. SM Kovalinsky says, this presentation shows how very deeply Strickland's decision was a part of the tragic consequences. With Caitlin and Mo. Okay. So all of this part of the media narrative surrounding Strickland is from January 2020. It's also important to locate this in the timeline. And this is the part, again, where you need to get under Strickland's skin, get into his headspace, and think about him reading this article as well. This article is about him. It's an article that's profiling him. Obviously, he's going to read it. Obviously, he's going to reflect on his own words, written on paper, and get that kind of distance and perspective. He's also going to look at voters' words right there in print and the fact that everyone's reading them. And I think Strickland was probably haunted by those words. I wish he had taken the chance. I wish he had taken the chance. Isn't he going to be thinking as well, I wish I had taken the chance, right? And so what happens when the next opportunity comes his way? It might be a romantic opportunity, but it might be, you get what I'm saying? What happens when the next opportunity comes his way? Is he going to take a risk that is almost too risky? He didn't take the one risk and then the ship sailed. Does he then take another risk in another area of his life that's even more risky in a sense? Sue Kavanaugh says, take the chance for what? Can anyone answer that for Sue? What we're talking about here, the chance to cycle in Paris-Roubaix and perhaps gain success. If you get a top 10 there, you can earn a fortune, and the whole world will kind of know your name, or the whole cycling world will. Whereas in gravel riding, you can remain anonymous even if you're very good, kind of thing. Mel Stiller says Mo represented Colin's possibilities and dreams. Caitlin was his reality and his present. That's very well put there. Well said, Mel. So where Vaughters said, I wish he had taken the chance, I think probably Colin felt the same way. And think about it, he did take a chance with Mo. He was playing his cards and trying to decide where he wanted to be. Because after 2020, he thought of himself as a big deal who had the world at his feet. So that is all from this particular publication, Velonews, very well written by Fred Dreyer from January 16, 2020, right? Now we're going to go to another article, that's this one. Colin Strickland, The 5 Races That Changed My Life, right? This is from Cycling News. And although he refers to 5 races, we're only going to deal with 2. This was published on June 18th, so around about 6 months after that one, and written by Daniel Benson, right? Gravel Racer picks the races that mean the most to him. What I really like about this article is it is narrated by, it is in the words of Colin Strickland. And because of that, because it's in his own words, you get a real sense of who he is. So it starts off with this introduction here. And it basically just says, it was a long road to the top of the gravel world. Only starting out racing at the age of 23, Strickland took in the road and fixed gear racing en route to where he is today. Here Strickland talks us through his career so far, picking out 5 key races that have meant the most to him, right? So as I say, now this is where you get a real sense of the real Colin Strickland, a hard luck, hard done by racer who grits his teeth, works harder than everyone else and beats them anyway. Just have a look at some of your questions here. Zircon says, was Red Bull his sponsor yet? I think it was. I know for a fact that he didn't want to give up Red Bull during the whole transfer to a professional UK squad, and he would have had to have given up his Red Bull sponsorship. So that's a really good question. Red Bull is also a very kind of aspirational, in-demand sponsor. Not any athlete can get it. So to have that and give that up is quite a big deal. Okay, so going to the article, I'm going to take you through this race, Gravel Worlds 2018, right? This is quoting from Cycling News. I'll put a link to that in chat if you want to follow with me. Yeah, Red Bull is a huge sponsor. Sue Kavanaugh says Red Bull hasn't dropped him yet. As far as I know, well, he's still on the Red Bull athletes page, but he took Red Bull off his Instagram. So if Red Bull hasn't dropped him, I think that's about to happen. I think it's not far away, kind of thing. Well, Terry's here. Terry says you're doing a good job. Thanks, Terry. Terry, apparently there's going to be a big article in the Austin Statesman tomorrow, so I hope you'll look out for that. Let me know when it comes out. W says, is he still riding professionally? Has this affected his career? It doesn't look like he's riding anymore. He's lost a lot of sponsors already. His Instagram, which was recently set to private, he said used to ride bicycles. So certainly in his mind, it appears that his racing days are over. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks for that. Okay, so now we go through a race that he did in 2018, Gravel Worlds. This is really an extraordinary story. So I'm going to just read this here. It's really a very interesting story. So as I say, he comes across as a hard luck, hard done by racer who grits his teeth, who works harder than everyone else and beats them anyway. So these are Strickland's words to Cycling News. Quote, the race couldn't have started any worse. I flatted at around mile 25. In other words, I had a flat tire early on, and it was a nightmare change. I lost over 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity as I stood there and watched the lead group, this elite group of riders, get smaller and smaller before eventually disappearing out of sight. When I finally got going, I had to chase solo for 50 miles, and at that point I thought, fuck it. I was either going to give up there and then or bury myself to get back into the race. I was literally 12 minutes behind a group of 50. So one rider riding on his own against the wind, pursuing a group of 50 riders where they got the benefit of different riders, riding into the wind. And that, in other words, so one rider riding behind another rider can save 30% of their energy, right? And so despite all of those advantages, he rides alone and he actually catches them. And he says he closed this 12-minute gap. And he said, I just burned down the barn to see what would happen. In other words, he gave everything. He put in 100% effort. And he said, luckily, there was something left afterwards. He says, I was riding on these endlessly long and rolling Nebraska roads. Let's just go to that. And then he said, they were like waves on the ocean, these roads. And he said, I could see the leaders up ahead, even though I was still 3 minutes back. But I felt that if I could bring them within sight, then I could make contact. So this is just what a determined fellow he is. He says, I managed to catch the lead group at mile 80. So remember, he lost them at mile 25. So 35 miles later, sorry, not 35, what is it? 45 miles later. Is it 45? 50, what is it? 55 miles later. Sorry, my math is a bit out. As I said, I had a couple of beers. So it takes him 55 miles to close 12 minutes, I think. And then he catches them at mile 80. And from there, he says, I made the selection for the main break. In other words, this group then broke off. And he said the final guy I was with, so there was a breakaway group and he was part of it, was a guy called Stevens. And he was the reigning Kanza champion. And I was watching him like a hawk as we entered the final couple of miles. I put in a massive attack with every bit of power I had left in my legs, and it was just enough to pull him off my wheel and take the win. The first 80 miles of that race had been a solo time trial at over 300 watts, and I really only started to race once I caught the leaders, but the event taught me that I had an engine for races that long and against a high level of competition. So when he talks about 300 watts, just to give an idea of how hardcore that is. Today, when I rode on my exercise bike for 40 minutes, I may have touched on 200 watts for a few seconds here and there. I think I averaged about 135 watts for 40 minutes. That was my average. Whereas he went more than twice that amount for, I'm not sure how long an 80-mile race would take, probably maybe 3 hours. I'm just trying to, yeah, 2 to 3 hours. So anyway, it just shows you what a really, really, really strong rider he is, right? And then, but the important thing is he realized this as well. He realized, well, I've got something special. And then he says the following. He says, until this win, I still saw myself as a fixed gear specialist. But in terms of gaining confidence, this was the race that set me on my way and proved to me that I was good enough. And so think about those words and then the question of going to Paris-Roubaix and proving something similar as well, right? Although this race, and it was, I think, a world championship race, although this proved who he was to himself, the whole Paris-Roubaix thing was a thing where he simply didn't have the confidence to see if he could prove that to himself. So these are his words. He says, in terms of gaining confidence, this was the race that set me on my way and proved to me that I was good enough. Now, I think one can almost ask, did it really? You can almost be rhetorical about it and say, did he gain enough confidence given what he was offered and the fact that he turned that down? What about that feeling of being good enough to be with Mo? Is that related here as well? Okay, so then he also makes kind of quite a sly comment right at the end of that. He says, as for everyone else, they had to find out the slow way, meaning when he realized he was good enough, it still took a lot of other people a long time or the slow way to figure out that he was good enough. It seems kind of a bit of a finger poke, doesn't it? Like he's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Stargirl, good to see you here. Okay, I just see there's someone who's been making comments that are really not acceptable, so I've just blocked them. Yeah, not quite sure why it was necessary to make those comments. I'm not even going to repeat them. Anyway, if you're still watching and you're wondering why you've blocked, well, that's why, because it's not acceptable making statements like that. Anyway, so if we bear in mind that this all happened in 2018, just 2 years later, this idea of knowing you was good enough was put to the test. Think about it. You proved yourself on this really important stage. People then offer you a chance to prove yourself even more, but then Colin doesn't believe in himself enough to actually take that opportunity, right? So although he says he had proved himself, you feel like there's still a little bit of doubt because certainly Vaughters from EF Education also felt he'd proved himself and also thought that he was capable of a lot more. But you can kind of argue that Strickland himself didn't think he was capable of a lot more, right? You had, in other words, the CEO of EF Education basically seeing more potential in Strickland than I think Strickland saw in himself. So as I said, there are 5 narratives in the Cycling News article. I'm only going to highlight 2, and this is the second. So the important thing to highlight from that first narrative is just how tough he is. And also at the end of it, he wins and he proves to himself something. He proves to himself how tough he is, how strong he is. And that's just one dimension of who he is as a person, right? I think there's a kind of a rough diamond thing that's going on. I think there's a part of him that's very strong, and he's a very gifted athlete. But I think there's another side that is to some extent brittle and fragile in terms of his confidence. He has confidence, but it's not quite as confident as in a way you would expect, in a way, right? So the second race that he mentions is from a really long time ago. It's from 11 years ago. It's what he calls an, I think, what does he call it? An alley cat race, right? And it is kind of what it sounds like. It's a race that is quite informal. It's not on a particular route. You find your route around a certain, I think it's around Austin, but you're allowed to kind of cut through certain urban sections. And so it's kind of almost like guerrilla riding. It's like it's not as formal as normal riding, if I can put it that way. Anyway, so this is what he says. He says, I was at the event in Austin and decided to enter this alley cat race because someone told me that the winner would receive this amazing frame. And there's actually a photo in this article. I think it's this image here. That's him holding this frame, and he's actually holding a Chanelli frame. And I actually owned a Chanelli. That was the very first bike frame that I owned, interestingly enough. Anyway, so he says, my prep for that race was non-existent. I was at university, so I was probably drinking the night before, and I was certainly enjoying some beers after the race. In the end, I won by a couple of minutes and thought, damn, I should think about this bike racing thing. So there's something a little bit arrogant about Strickland in terms of Strickland, the athlete. But having said that, I think one can say it's maybe a healthy arrogance. I think any good athlete needs to be a little bit arrogant. I think they need a little bit of whatever you call extra confidence, right? I know when I was at advertising school, when people liked me, they said he's very confident. When they didn't like me, they said he's very arrogant. But I think you get a kind of a good arrogance that's associated with certain sports stars. And I think he has some of that here where he says, my prep for the race was non-existent and I was drinking beers and all that kind of thing. But I mean, look at what happened. He won. He backed himself in this situation and he won. He goes on to say, as a kid, I didn't have a bike and I wouldn't have even have known where to start. It's a niche sport and it's not been effectively developed here in America. But I entered this alley cat on a titanium fixed gear bike with no brakes. I was obsessed with retro Campagnola. That's just a kind of bike parts, another bike manufacturer's Shimano. And so he said, I had old campy cranks on it. The cranks are what the pedals are on. He said it was a really incredible bike to ride, especially for Texas and Austin area, because there are some rolling areas where you can have fun. It made me strong. So once again, you see Strickland describing himself as an underdog who persists and wins despite all the handicaps he faces. Then he says, but I turned up for this race in jeans and no shirt. I feel like I have to explain a bit more about what an alley cat is. Basically, in this instance, it was a 30-mile loop around Austin. and you had to choose your own adventures. You ticked off several checkpoints. There were 5 spots around the city, and you'd have your papers signed at each checkpoint. So you'd sort of ride as fast as you could. You'd get to a certain checkpoint. Maybe you had a map with you, maybe not. Maybe you just needed to have a map of the city in your head, and then someone would you'd sign off somewhere, and then you would go on to the next one. And he said this race was at night on your own, and there's moving traffic. If you commute on a bike, that's not really an issue for you. Looking back, it sounds slightly dangerous, but it's an alley cat, so you leave the accountability at home as you risk life and limb for a $800 frame. Now think about those words, and the kind of guy he was in 2010, and he wins this race by backing himself, by being confident, by taking a chance. And then where is this person 9 years later when he's offered the opportunity of a lifetime to cycle in Paris-Roubaix? He seems like the perfect candidate for that, doesn't he? Pauline says, we all admire perseverance. So he goes on to say, let me just reiterate where he says, looking back, it sounds slightly dangerous, but it's an alley cat. So you leave the accountability at home as you risk life and limb for an $800 frame. Now, can you just think about him applying that psychology to Paris-Roubaix? Could he have, or should he have? What do you guys think? Paul asks, would he ever have made the cut for the Tour de France? It's a good question. I think if you cycle for a outfit like this, or EF Education like that, then I mean those teams do cycle in the Tour de France. So I think the answer is yes. He could have if he wanted to. Katie says there's a difference between self-confidence and narcissism. I don't know if you can. I think what's going on here is the opposite of narcissism, which is he doesn't give himself enough credit to take the chance that he wants. So the point you're trying to make is actually the opposite. It's not that he thinks a lot of himself, it's that he doesn't think enough of himself. Okay, so as I say, here you see Strickland as a risk taker and an opportunist. Think about how that translates to the love triangle scenario, but also how inexplicably it doesn't translate to him taking an opportunity and a risk to race professionally in Europe. Somewhere deep down, either he didn't believe in himself or he was perhaps too greedy, but very likely it was a tough pill to swallow either way. It had to have been tough to be offered the fairy tale only to turn one's back on your own fairy tale. Have you ever done that? Have you been offered the chance of a lifetime only to say no, only to use logic and to say no? And so the final thing that he says in this particular article from Cycling News is he says, you'll have to ask the other races as to whether they took me seriously or not, but it was my first race and my first win. From there, I made my way through the ranks to where I am today, still racing, taking it a bit more seriously, but not that much. And that's quite an interesting comment again, right at the end, where he says, look where I am today. I'm still racing. I'm taking it a bit more seriously, but not that much. Now in his last narrative, he talks about drinking and arriving at a race without a t-shirt, without a shirt, and racing in jeans and racing on a machine that is fixed gear, etc., etc. And he talks about, I'm not taking things that seriously. But he seemed to take the offer to do Paris-Roubaix so seriously that he ended up not taking it. It seemed to be too serious an offer. So think about those words. Is he taking what happened on May 11th? Is he taking that seriously? Is he taking the murder of Mo Wilson seriously? Was he too serious or not serious enough? Or a bit of both at the wrong time? What do you guys think? What do you guys think about that? So I want to see if I can bring up Teal Akerson. Hopefully these are going to come up. Hopefully these are going to come up. Let's see if they do. So this is Teal Akerson's profile. This is the profile of the chap who I spoke about in the previous video, the guy that sort of dated Caitlin while she was in Costa Rica. And he dated her up until, or he sort of, went out with her up until I think 3 days before her arrest, right? So this is his Instagram, quite simple. Yeah, it's not really letting me open these pages up. But there you can see the surfing. The mushrooms come up every now and then. Hopefully this will let me play this. There we go. So he seems like quite a playful fellow, doesn't he? Maybe also a guy who's interested in yoga and kind of partying. So I just thought I would share that with you guys. There's another image of him that comes up somewhere else where he looks quite different. So this is quite a recent picture of him. He looks quite different to the Teal Akerson that you see on Instagram. But this, in a way, reminds me of the image of Rose Davis looking at her phone and remembering Gabby Petito in a way. I know it's different, but it just reminds me of the same thing. Okay, so that is my spiel, guys. That's all I've got for you. I see there's still 180 of you watching, but that is really all I've got to share with you guys. Shoshana says Caitlin was trying to reinvent herself. Definitely. Katie says he looks older. I agree, he does look a bit older. Scott Rayburn says that is the biggest hang up, is being insecure. I do think insecurity plays a role here. I think that Caitlin was quite insecure, hence her meltdown in Indonesia. And I think because she's insecure, I mean, there must be some reason why she got on with Colin Strickland. Maybe there was some insecurity with him as well. And maybe there was also some insecurity with Mo Wilson. I mean, that one text she sends where she says, I'm confused about us. She's a human being. And, she was quite insecure about what was going on between the two of them. And I think she had a right to be. But I do think insecurity is part of um, the sort of maelstrom that is part of the scenario of what happened in this case, if that makes sense. I think if people were a lot more confident in this love triangle, there wouldn't have been a love triangle. Does that make sense? It's a good point from Bria. Bria also talks about Caitlin's insecurities regarding Mo. I mean, you could also see it another way where Caitlin could say, you know what, if you are going to kind of be messing around, I deserve better than this. I'm out, right? I've got my whole life ahead of me. See ya, kind of thing, right? You can kind of be assertive and confident, although it's easier said than done. If you're not assertive and you're not confident, it's another thing trying to pretend you are, right? J. Kate says insecurity is the key to unlocking this case. So what I've tried to do in this sort of whole thing is show you a side to Colin that is something you haven't seen before. So he's quite a accomplished athlete. I think we knew that, but he's also a very determined, hard, tough guy. But right next to that is perhaps a somewhat fragile sense of self-esteem that I think one wouldn't expect, right? And I think something that is quite close to that sense of fragility, that sense of anxiety, is the financial scenario, the financial situation. Okay, so Terry says, I wonder why Mo didn't act on the red flags that were coming up. I think it's more complicated than just that. I think Mo was probably being counseled by Colin. In other words, Colin was giving her advice, Colin was helping her get sponsors. Mo probably wanted to get sponsored by Red Bull as well. So I think there was an aspect to their relationship that was functional and sort of practical. And in a real way, he could be a mentor to her, right? And I think it gets quite confusing when someone is that, but they are also a young, inspiring, um, whatever the word is, charming athlete that you like, right? So in other words, it's two things are going on. There's the functional and practical advice that you're getting, and then there's also the feelings of attraction that one person has for another. And it's hard to maybe differentiate between the two. Mo was probably taking her cue from him. He's going to decide who he's in a relationship with. And she probably thought that he has made up his mind and probably or possibly didn't realize to what extent he hadn't, or to what extent things were in a state of flux. I don't know. Okay, so we're at an hour 39. I don't think I'm going to take it further than that. I just want to thank Sarah Terry for your super chat. I don't know if I've missed anyone else. I know I spent quite a long time going through the script, so if I did miss anyone. Thought Criminal has been a member for 5 months, says, I think it's suspicious that Colin purchased Caitlin a gun, knowing what she was like. Well, I certainly think it's ill-advised. Certainly was ill-advised. So in terms of the poll, how is that relevant to me? Remember Colin saying that. Do you think Strickland's backstory is relevant to Mo and Caitlin? 90% say yes. Well, his backstory definitely is relevant, and I think we've gotten some kind of idea how and why it is relevant, right? So I hope you guys will go and have a look at these articles, great articles from Velonews and Cycling News, right? And the main thing to take out of this is this whole idea of he's too old, where I think he's realizing himself. I think Colin Strickland realized himself that he's too old. You know, that is his age in terms of his career was going to be a factor. And on the other hand, you could say not necessarily Lance Armstrong performed at a certain level up until the age of about 39. So it's not necessarily the case, kind of thing. I've also heard that older athletes often are better in terms of endurance because their thinking is that they're not as easily flustered, they're not as impulsive as younger athletes. So sometimes an older athlete can make up for the folly of youth by just being smarter and more strategic, and also just being mentally tougher. And I do see that a bit with Colin Strickland. I just don't know whether he saw that with himself. It's quite an interesting point. Cosmic Dreamer says he was old enough to look at a younger woman. Yeah, it's a good point. Becky Shetter says, thanks, Nick. New things to think about. Okay, so I'm not going to take it further than that. Thanks a lot for joining me here. There have been some interesting comments. We'll look out for the article coming out in the Austin Statesman tomorrow. It's apparently going to be, I think, a big tell-all, but we'll look out. We'll look into the media narrative, keep track of that, and see what else comes out. Obviously, there's also the trial that is imminent, and obviously looks like a lot more is going to be coming to light over the next couple of weeks and months. So we'll definitely be monitoring this story. Let's just have a look at your last couple of comments. Just a couple of you saying thank you. Thank you for being here, Bria. I feel like I'm in your country all the time, just watching the Tour de France. What a beautiful country France is. Paul Terry says, I'll try and get it hot off the press. I used to work for AAS. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks a lot for that. Looking forward to that as well. Shoshana says, great deep dive, Nick. Thanks. Okay, so that is it, guys. Hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, wherever you are. I'm going to put Timmy to bed and make some hot chocolate, and that'll be me for today. All the best. Stay safe. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And I'll see some of you for the Van Gogh Letters, episode 22, tomorrow. Otherwise, look out for updates on the Caitlin Armstrong case going forward. Okay. See you guys next time.